Hello and welcome to Fixed, the podcast by the Fix Media where we unpack media insight and take you behind the scenes of editorial decision, strategy, and innovation in the industry. I'm Orsi and I will be your host today. Before we dive in, subscribe, follow, and if you like what you hear, support us at the Fix.media. Hello everyone, today I'm very happy to welcome Ryan Powell, Head of Innovation and Media Business at the Vienna-based International Press Institute. Ryan held many newsrooms to navigate crisis and to grow, and we are going to talk about what effective support looks like for newsrooms and how they navigate and experience crises. Hello Ryan, how are you?
Hi, Orsi. Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Would you mind sharing a couple of extra words about your work at IPI?
Yes, absolutely. So, at the International Press Institute, which is itself a 75-year-old membership network that focuses on defending independent journalism around the world, with a lot of our work really doing advocacy around the political, legal, physical, digital threats facing journalists. Over the last few years, the organization realized the importance of viable, sustainable media as a pillar of press freedom. So the department that I lead at IPI ultimately responds to that question, supporting newsrooms all around the world, navigating some of the technical, business level political disruptions that are facing the sector. Sometimes this is focusing on revenue generation. In other cases, this is focused on developing, audience understanding, coming up with format strategies, doubling down on organizational capacity, the kind of factors that we see as essential to a publisher's sustainability. So we host a series of programs doing this, as well as community building activities, both online and through an in-person event every year.
So, based on this, you work with independent newsroom across very different political, economic, and cultural contexts. When a newsroom enters, let's say, a crisis mode, what does that usually look like from the inside, and how early do they realize that they are heading towards some big issues?
Yeah, great question. I mean, of course, this is unique to every individual organization, but I'd maybe start by defining what we mean by crisis. Shocks and crises do come in many different shapes and sizes. And a distinction that we typically see in our work at IPI is between the economic and political crises, as well as the pace. So whether it's sudden or a more slowly evolving crisis. To start with the economic question, I think it's sort of a shared understanding that in 2026, most media around the world are already operating under tight margins financially, but have also shown that they're very good at maximizing output with few financial and human resources. The signs would normally be seen through payroll. How many more months can they, of course, pay for their staff given, revenue predictability? This may be a consequence of many internal or external factors, but unfortunately, purely from a business perspective, or in relation to subscription or reader revenue models, media are typically the first expense that people cut during tough economic times. Um, I think one experience worth sharing to provide context is in 2025, as foreign aid to the media sector around the world was cut in dramatic ways. Roughly, just from the U.S., I think there was a $256 million promised that never ended up in the sector. And right now I'm in the middle of advising around 20 investigative media outlets that lost out on what was between 60 to 90% of their annual revenue in the form of unearned income as grants. And you could consider this a pretty explicit crisis. So how are they coping? I mean, immediately they're cutting back on staff, typically their most significant cost center. However, they continue to go all in on content creation, keeping up with publishing schedules. They're also strategizing for the near and medium term. So how can they quickly turn around new strategies in response, like time-based fundraising campaigns, while building systems that enable diversification away from a single source of revenue? But we also know how damaging, and immediate changes in things like platform traffic can be due to, for example, algorithm changes and the impacts that have on newsrooms from the inside. For example, I think in 2025, in Turkey, two independent media companies, Gazete Duvar and Arti Geracek, shut down due to changes in Google's algorithm, specifically their Discover and News products, which directly hit their finances, amongst many other organizations speaking out. I think politically, you can also see these crises kind of unfolding in slow and fast ways. Sometimes it takes the form of intimidation, such as an inquiry, an audit, a licensing review initiated by the government, as well as other forms of regulatory pressure or lawfare, like criminal defamation cases or abuses of regulations, or more immediately through the arrests of journalists, and legal cases against them. You don't need to go any further than the Maria Ressa case in the Philippines, and her work at Rappler. Of course, this has been a drawn out legal battle, but of course that reflects very much the kind of what it looks like, I guess, from an organization internally in terms of crisis mode, responding to these bigger questions.
You already mentioned a couple of things, but from your experience, how do editorial teams and management tend to react differently to crisis situations, and where do you most often see like some sort of a tension to emerge? Because you mentioned that like the first thing first, when it's about reacting to crises, it's cutting back on staff, cutting back on whatever can be cut off. It should be off. So, what do you think from your experience? How do editorial teams and management react differently to these situations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in my work, this tends to depend on the size of the organization. But in general, editorial teams would naturally be focused on protecting their editorial independence and preserving their reputation with audiences. Trust is a huge premium in this sector. Without trust, the brand of journalism in a given context loses a lot of its capacity to do its job. While I think management is typically more focused on questions of financial health and legal liability, they usually would see this through the prism of risk management. But I think, given the size of organizations and in some smaller media, editorial is management. And we often see media charging ahead without always paying, close mind to the kind of financial or political fallout. But I would say in larger organizations, of course, there's more scope for tension, and of course, this focuses on like the source of revenue for these organizations. I was on a call yesterday with an investigative publisher that is really in need of donations. They do receive reader support, and however, their management team said, or which includes some journalists, refuses to take any donations or support from politicians involved in the government. And I think that can provide some kind of scope for questions about okay, what are the red lines in terms of our kind of editorial policy as it interacts with the business. But I think as those two divisions are typically very separate, um, certainly you know it takes leadership to sort of steer through what can be very challenging times. But I think it's also a question of prioritization. Where and how, in a context of crisis, does an organization allocate its resources, its human, its financial resources? Um, does it make sure that it has savings available to steer through many more months of crisis, or does it focus on paying the immediate salaries of journalists? So of course there is plenty of room for tension with these types of situations.
Across the newsrooms that you advised, what do you see any recurring patterns when it comes to problems and challenges? Because I tend to think that if someone is very interested about these issues, problems, and crises, it's usually because you might see something that's reoccurring every now and then. So, do you see anything that can be taken as a pattern?
Yeah, I think plenty of patterns when it comes to sort of problems or challenges. I think in the sector more broadly, we're seeing referral traffic falling off a cliff. In general, there's a declining willingness of users to pay for journalism. The advertising is also declining enormously to journalism because of some of these traffic questions. The growth of users worldwide paying more attention to news creators is also presenting some questions about the how more traditional newsrooms are kind of managing their relevance, their their access to attention in this new economy. And that also has led to talent leaving organizations and developing and launching their own personal newsletters or podcasts. But of course, that's more of a kind of management question. I think funding instability is a huge challenge at the moment. We're also seeing statistics over and over suggesting declining trust in media. I think as a sector, we would like to think that as AI slop kind of permeates the online sphere, that maybe individuals would fall back on newsrooms made up of human journalists that are actually creating experiences through their stories, that would be a reliable source. But unfortunately, we still do see these declining trust metrics. And on top of that, there's factors like AI driven disinformation. There's a fragmentation of audiences across multiple platforms and formats. So keeping up with this is, of course, some of the big challenges. I think I would be remiss not to mention some of the political pressures that the sector is facing. Obviously, as a press freedom advocacy organization, this is top of mind at IPI. We've seen targeted systemic takeovers of media companies in recent years. In Romania, there were controversial firings of editorial management at a group called Libertatea by its Swiss owner Ringier in 2023, which it denies, which led to editors breaking off. In Hungary, you saw a pro-Orban investor coming in to index his ownership structure, whereby the editorial team, in fact, added a barometer of pressure on a separate site to alert the public. And once that pressure barometer grew too much, the editorial team, most of it, resigned and started Telex, which is still operating independently. So we do see a variety of different challenges that implicate different parts of the business or politics around them. But I would say these are trends that are increasing in frequency, and I think coming up with strategies for resilience is absolutely critical.
I think when you're working in such field, you already see if in some countries something is happening. Do you think that there are like specific early warning signs that would suggest that a newsroom or even a country and the media in the country is heading towards serious trouble, even if the journalism itself is strong?
Absolutely. I think, again, this is sort of distinguished between the political challenges and the economic challenges. Certainly, I was chatting with a colleague yesterday who said if you want to crush a media, you hit their bottom line financially as well as attack politically. This is not an insignificant risk in general. And I think, we've seen lots of pressure being put on everything from private media to public service broadcasting corporations. Just in December of 2025 in Lithuania, the public broadcaster LRT faced a politically motivated audit, for example, which in fact through EU pressure was actually slowed down. And I think those levels of political changes do, signify early warning signs, especially for IPI, and we monitor these and pay as much attention as we can. I think from the business perspective, so metrics, right? These are usually what we would look at in terms of an individual outlet's risk factors and early warning signs. Subscriber numbers could be falling on a quarterly basis. Advertisers could be pulling out. Some of this is due to the general state of the economy. I was a publisher of a magazine in during COVID, for example, where COVID hit the industry super hard, and most of our advertisers pulled out simply because they didn't have the budget for it, and that impacted the sort of sustainability of our business at the time enormously. I think what often goes glossed over is an over reliance in this new economy of sort of creators, etc., is a over reliance on a singular individual to lead your brand's growth and maintain and drive attention. um, I've seen quite a few businesses fail to manage talent in a way that diversifies exactly kind of who maintains and leads kind of the organization's reputation. You need to continue investing in a variety of journalists and media players and in an organization and that can be for me a risk of an early warning sign of a potential risk for an organization. Hiring freezes are of course also a major sign from a business health perspective. But yeah, I think these sort of political questions to me ring strongest. Whether it's funding cuts from governments like the United States dropping off 200, so failing to deliver its promised $268 million in 2025, as well as foundations who typically prop up many organizations around the world, revisiting their commitment to journalism. I think Craig Newmark just last week wrote a piece in the Neiman Lab, spelling out his case as to why he's no longer planning to support media as much as he had in the past. For me, that's a huge early warning sign in terms of how this sector can kind of maintain.
Like in the episode, sounds like we're a great match, and we couldn't be happier. If you'd like to strengthen our bond, support us by donating or joining our membership program. That's it. No more interruptions. Back to the episode.
Now let's talk a little bit about the support itself, because we talked about the issues, the problems. So maybe let's turn to a more optimistic part of this conversation. So when a newsroom is under pressure, what intervention tend to help the most in the short term, and which well-intended solution often fail to even make things worse? Because I think especially when we are talking about small independent newsrooms, when they realize that something is off, sometimes how they try to help themselves might not be the best idea that they pull off. What do you think about this?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. Under pressure, of course, it's tough to come up with the best intervention. It does depend a lot on circumstance. I think if there's like a really high risk level in terms of safety, risk mitigation is absolutely of paramount importance. Whether that's planning for different eventualities, prioritizing safety, or access to legal support. Of course, organizations like Media Defense exist to respond to some of these immediate questions. IPI also does a lot of tracking and drawing attention to certain political risks, and these interventions within different national contexts can be significant, can generate significant impact, where enough pressure in fact deters, whether it's some of these cases of lawfare or audits or other forms of pressure on the sector. But from a kind of financial and business perspective, it is hard to plan long term under pressure. I've heard a great deal recently in different contexts that suggesting, for example, a journalist move from into a context of exile is not necessarily welcome. Of course, they'd rather remain and make a difference at home, despite the risk. And these are tough situations. But I think starting off with some of these kind of fundamental near-term planning questions about what the circumstance they're in is really important before I guess the sort of classic principle of do no harm, right? And make sure that there's a lot of transparency as one is having a conversation with an organization in a kind of immediate context of under pressure. And from there, of course, coming up with strategies and plans and systems, and potentially connecting with relevant actors like Media Defense for legal support. And I think there's a mix of opportunities. Of course, you can lean into your national level journalistic associations, which around the world vary in terms of their level of capacity to affect change. And then there's the layer of kind of international advocacy, which is also really important to bring into certain contexts. But of course, there's risk calculus associated with all of these choices.
How do you help newsroom prioritize when everything feels urgent? What do you see from your experience? What newsroom tend to prioritize and what they should prioritize?
Yeah, prioritization is a super important piece of generally how independent media around the world operate. Most of the organizations I've worked with, either in house as working myself in media or supporting, do have a very hard time prioritizing. It's not their initial instinct. And whether it's responding to these sort of shiny objects or wanting to onboard all of the latest tools and technology, focus is something that I spend a lot of time talking about when I work with organizations today. Of course, we use a specific tool which focuses directly on prioritization. This is not the first thing we start talking about, but we use this impact effort matrix, which helps teams prioritize tasks or projects by evaluating their potential impact and the effort required to implement them. Basically, you have low-hanging fruit. This could be stuff that could be delivered within the next 3 weeks, 2 weeks, and doesn't take as much effort. But it's really just a simple decision-making tool that helps prioritize tasks. And I think, there's also then major projects, right, which you don't want to do too many of in a given quarter. But so long as the leadership team, whether it's sales, marketing, editorial, even tech, and then of course the leadership themselves, so long as they are all on board with the choices that they're making, prioritizing, I think there's a higher level for success. Whether it's differentiated between editorial integrity versus revenue versus staff well-being, I think these are very internal questions which need to be really driven and steered by a newsroom's leadership. And I imagine many are thinking a lot about their what is the sort of immediate consideration. Oftentimes, right, staff well-being is super super important. Revenue takes a back seat in a lot of the cases that I've worked on. And ensuring editorial integrity is usually so core to an organization's mission that it ends up taking of paramount importance. So yeah, I think that's generally how we think about prioritization. But of course, it's something that every organization needs to work on and as early as possible.
From your perspective, what does good support for independent media actually mean, and how does it differ from one-off grants, for example?
Yeah, I think there's a big tension in this kind of like grant supported ecosystem of kind of short term interventions versus kind of holistic, longer term sort of structural change. There's I think for me, I would like to highlight some of the things I look for in when designing programs to make sure that they are in fact impactful, not just in the near term, but in the long term. I think coming up with solutions to continuous support is absolutely critical. One way we do that at IPI is through developing peer-to-peer networks. We create spaces in which newsrooms themselves can exchange and, across some ideas and challenges that they might have. Um, I think starting my career and then getting into funding journalism personally, I realized that there's can be distorted incentives in the development sector, and I really promised that I would never fund content getting too close to the question of editorial freedom. However, I think supporting organizations with business and product development, which we currently do in our innovation department, for me, there's a clear need here, and it's focusing on the steps and methods that directly impact their bottom line and is just simply more powerful by way of freeing up more of their journalists' time by having systems, having structures that these organizations can lean back on. But I think it's there are awkward incentives sometimes in the kind of donor community and donor incentive structure. But one of the critical pieces here is in fact kind of modeling for continuous support, developing peer-to-peer networks, even in regional levels, and making sure that the work you're doing is fitting into the existing ecosystem, that you're not recreating models. I think one-off grants and generic training. I mean, one-off grants can be helpful if there's like a specific, challenge that you're responding to that can be solved in a shorter way. But for me, I think having some, even just simpler tools, methods that an organization can stick with and use as they move well beyond the duration of a specific project is really critical. And I think generating those connections and support networks is also a way to ensure that there's a kind of multiplier effect to the work that development organizations or support organizations end up doing.
Talking about this connection between people and between organization, what do you think? What role does trust play between advisors, funders, and newsroom, especially when difficult decisions are on the table?
Yeah, I think trust is essential, but and coming from IPI's perspective, any advisor we work with, we vet them on this up front, would not be prescribing specific solutions. They provide advice on options, on decision-making processes. As I had just mentioned, we focus on the tools that enable a company to make these decisions themselves. I hear, unfortunately, a lot of advisors out in the world prescribing solutions. You need to monetize your newsletter. You need to build a membership business. I, firmly push back on that pattern, knowing that the processes are absolutely critical to an organization actually owning the choices that they're making. The newsrooms themselves would need to be brought into the need for collecting audience data, for setting up requirements lists for new technology as they start talking to sales folks or reps from different software companies. Ultimately, they need to own these choices themselves. And that's why, in the design of our 8-month, support model for newsrooms, we spend so much time reflecting on the decision-making process, on identifying pain points and making sure that they are aware of the options and trade-offs, and that choice is ultimately their own. And I think that for me solves the problem of this trust question, right? Like, I think if you come with a prescribed set of solutions that can sacrifice trust over time, especially, even if it seems like, this sounds like a great idea. But, you have to, set up these leaders, these decision makers in newsrooms for success, whether it's scaling down, right? If they're having to fire employees because they've lost costs, they have to be able to weigh the different options in front of them. And sometimes they just need support during that process, but ultimately it's their choice. I think trust can be also derived from experience, right? We usually work with experts that are either actively within newsrooms making these choices and decisions every day themselves, so that they have a very kind of careful understanding of each nuance of these choices, business decisions, etc. And that ultimately, does build a high level of trust between the organizations that we set up with different experts. So I think, that for me is the important piece of trust, but it is critical.
What do you think, or do you think at all if, do you think if funders and support organizations still misunderstand about how newsrooms experience crisis?
Over time, I think I've seen that, a lot of funders and support organizations are not always like from the context that, these particular crises are happening. So of course they might not be able to experience, connect with them on an emotional level. I think, though, I wouldn't overemphasize that. I am seeing a lot of positive momentum with the development of regional networks where the energy, the initiative, the support is developed organically out of these contexts and amongst journalists and newsroom leaders and managers from regions or even globally. Even IPI, right? Like in the 1950s when we were founded, this was a group of editors who created this project and ultimately have maintained for nearly 8 decades, monitoring and working on these kind of global questions around press freedom. at the moment, for example, I'm advising the development of a network of journalists and media in South Asia who are, ultimately preparing to support one another facing professional, legal, or safety pressures. And even they're coming up with a strategy to collectively engage with funders to align with the regional journalistic needs. At the end of the day, oftentimes funding comes from outside of the regions where one's based. There can be steps taken to unlock, sources of capital in those regional contexts, but as one relies on sources of financing from outside that region, I think the best a group of journalists can do is respond collectively, setting the terms and engaging proactively with those organizations. But I think, yeah, so long as funders and support organizations have themselves experience in the sector, I don't worry too much about their ability to understand crises on a human level. When you have folks without necessarily a strong background in journalism, that of course creates space for a potential miscommunication or lack of understanding. But my sense is that a lot of folks in this sector have themselves plenty of media experience and expertise that definitely mitigates a lot of that potential challenge.
We are slowly finishing this conversation. I have just a couple of more extra questions. So, has your understanding of sustainability changed across the years?
Oof, yeah, definitely. That unequivocally, yes. I think more and more I question the feasibility sometimes of financial viability. I mean, in my work in the innovation department at IPI, we're working on a variety of ideas, from unlocking new sources of private capital to engaging with advertisers and encouraging them to work with independent media. Or, our advocacy work also does focus on policies that could potentially subsidize the sector. But ultimately, if I'm honest, sustainability comes from the team running the organization. If they are open, if they have structured decision making processes, as well as previously mentioned for prioritization, if they're thinking about new technologies in critical ways, and adapting to their consumer market in creative ways, that is really, I was telling a few, smaller investigative media outlets this recently, leaning into this sort of DNA that's unique to their organization. I think that there is a much greater possibility of maintaining. But I think kind of coasting along, as a lot of the especially the support sector has had expected over the last 2 decades, is no longer viable. And I think newsrooms themselves need to get creative, scrappy. They need to test ideas. They need to make sure they fit with their organization, with their market. And yeah, sustainability at that stage is possible. And I also think that the funding ecosystem itself is revisiting a lot of their assumptions and making sure that the newsrooms they work with have a strategy for sustainability, whether it's medium or long term, investing in certain capacities that are required to maintain technically, operationally, an organization, alongside, prioritizing, of course, the quality of the media they're building. But with so much disruption, I think it's okay to say that one's understanding of sustainability has to change in a given year. We don't know what the AI landscape is going to do to the sort of world of journalism over the next 12 months. We're watching it closely. That will impact the sort of calculation of sustainability. But I think so long as we're open to that change, it's really important.
And lastly, for newsroom leaders listening to this episode who feel they already in crisis, what's the first honest question they should ask themselves?
Yeah, this is a important one. I think, what are the three biggest risks our organization could face in the next 3 months? And then ultimately focus on finding solutions for those risks, or at least planning ahead for what those risks might impact, whether it's political. We outlined a variety of political risks earlier on, political pressure, taking out a stake in independent media, It could be, lawfare, other sources of pressure. Or also all of those kind of operational and business questions, map them out, have honest discussions with all of your leadership members in a team, and think about a few steps you can take to mitigate those challenges so that you're not surprised when they show up, when they rear their head, and that you're not on your heels. Because I think if you're caught off guard by especially some of these sudden crises we spoke about today, like funding cuts, and changes in algorithms, you need to have a strategy if you're being taking seriously the viability of your organization and serving your audience. And ultimately, I think this has been said 1,000 times over, but leaning into your audience is a great way to mitigate both political and business risks. You have to be creative with your outreach strategies, whether you're developing fundraising campaigns, whether you're getting people invested in your company and the idea and mission that you're building and delivering, or whether you're simply drawing attention to some of the bigger political risks that you're facing. These are essential elements of how you can kind of adapt and plan and be a little bit less vulnerable, as I think media just faces one of the most uncertain periods of its existence. There's no silver bullet, but I think planning for those risks can be a really effective way to at least mitigate both near and medium term risk.
All right, Ryan, thank you so much for joining Fixed today.
Thanks so much, Orsi. It's great to hear from you and talk to your community.
To everyone listening, thanks for tuning into Fixed. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast, follow the Fix online, and yes, we're now also on TikTok. Want to support our work? Visit the Fix.media and explore our new membership program.